want to run the machine, you gotta understand how it works. Hey, I am Chuck the Bureaucrat, and today I am going to give you my complete description of how the Pentagon runs. Not all the rules and policies, 'cause God, that would kill us all, but a basic mental model. And the most important thing to realize is that the Pentagon is a giant biological computer that organizes and uses human beings to perform many of its necessary tasks. Why human beings and not actual computer microprocessors? Well, it has to do with the central task of bureaucracy, particularly military bureaucracy. You see, the Pentagon is not generating revenue by accomplishing its missions. It's not producing a product or selling a service. Instead, the Pentagon is competing with other federal agencies for a slice of the congressional budget. And at the same time, they distribute that money down through their subordinate organizations who are all clamoring for their bite at the apple. If you tried to build a computer program to outwit rooms full of human beings in this kind of competition, well, the computer would get tricked in a heartbeat. There is just no algorithm for winning a negotiation between multiple adversaries, all so hell-bent on stealing your cookies. And so we use human beings as the basic building blocks of the system because they have a capacity for complex adaptability, broad and continuous assumption testing, and an adaptable user interface. All right, at the most basic level, you have a human being, a person, just like you. And like a microprocessor, that human takes inputs, performs some tasks on those inputs, and then generates outputs. Honestly, some people are better processors than others. Some people take in huge amounts of information, they do complex tasks on that, and then they generate output that's useful to a wide audience. And then others, well, not so much. Now, generally, these people are organized into what I call the three-layer model. At the top, you've got executives, general officers, and SESs. These people make decisions, they set policy across a wide number of issues, and they serve as the face of the organization. At the bottom, you've got action officers, who get into the details of individual issues. They produce most of the products, and they do a lot of legwork, gathering information and vetting facts. In the Pentagon, action officers are mostly majors and lieutenant colonels, GS 12 through 14, and then contractors with similar credentials or backgrounds. Between the executives and the action officers, there's an important layer called the directors. These are typically GS-15 or colonels, maybe Navy captains. Most directors have a portfolio of issues that the executive is responsible for, and then a stable of action officers sufficient to meet the executive's needs on those issues. One of the key functions of the directors is to control the flow of information between the executive and the AOs. Ideally, the action officers have like a mind-boggling amount of detail for the issues that they cover. The director modulates the amount of that information that goes up to the executive, so there's not too much, not too little, but just the right amount and at the right time. At the same time, the director controls the flow of information down from the executives to the action officers. Sometimes they flesh out the guidance from the executive. In fact, in a lot of cases, directors anticipate guidance from the execs to get the right work started at the right time. Other times, the director takes a butt chewing from the executive and calmly walks back down and tells the action officers, use blue font instead of yellow. Now, there are a couple of things to bear in mind when it comes to the three-layer model. First, of course, there are more than just 3 layers in the whole system, But if you were to try to look at all the layers, well, you'd get vertigo. Secondly, at any point in time, you should be able to look around and understand the layers above you and below you and what type of work you're doing within that model. In fact, even in an infantry company, you might notice that this 3-layer model starts to kick in. Anyways, the important aspect about these layers is how they cooperate with each other, but they compete with other groups organized in that same model. In the Pentagon, many offices are organized into this 3-layer model. And in most situations, they do not form some giant pyramid. In fact, what they do is they press against each other, all competing for their own slice of that budgetary pie. This is the battlefield that you enter when you first sign into the Pentagon. And now I want to go back to talking about the individuals who make up this system. The reason this is important is because as you and your piece of the puzzle task organize to compete for resources, it's important to put the right people on the right tasks. Doing so makes all the difference between easy victory and frustrating defeat. Oh, and before we go too far, let me make this point. You win by having the right mix of different people on your team. Pentagon organizations that rely too heavily on one archetype of personality, well, they tend to have organizational fatal flaws that just get them pummeled. And what's funny is offices that consistently lose, they never really seem to come to grips with their design flaws. Okay, the first and most visible attribute of any of these people who you're plugging into your team is their employment category. Military, civilian, and contractor, and each of them comes with inherent strengths and weaknesses. Military, the guys in uniform, they have skin in the game. They understand that the resources and the policies swirling around the puzzle palace, well, they're going to affect them and their soldiers. Plus, military tend to be in the prime of their lives, energetic and reasonably tireless. So, one of the ways that the military gets used is to work really long days. Thing is, if you see somebody leaving the Pentagon at 8 p.m., it's a good bet they're military. The downside of military folks is that they're usually doing on-the-job training. They might not know much about the details of their job, and by the time they learn them, well, they just get reassigned. Result, military are great for work that requires a tough spirit, but if you're dealing with long-range, grinding policy work, well, you're going to need a different kind of employee. Enter the government civilian. You're often going to hear these people referred to as the institutional knowledge, but the real value is that they can work on incredibly long-term projects. Many of them stay in a single office, even a single job for years, even decades. They develop the skills, the background, the experience, the relationships, and the battle scars necessary to help keep the organization consistent and compliant. The downside of civilians, at least from the perspective of most military, is that they appear very slow to change. Since they've been around so long, they've often been the victim of some administrative catastrophe, and a lot of their actions are designed to make sure that that catastrophe does not happen again. Of course, that hard-learned lesson is often so far back in the past that the military folks don't understand why things are the way they are, or just how bad things could get if they changed the status quo. So, if you want a rapid and agile transformation that kind of rocks the boat a little bit, civilians may not be the right people for the job. But while you're doing all that boat rocking, if you want to make sure you don't tip the whole works over, well, a civilian may be just what you need. As a result, one of the ways that civilians get utilized is with annual processes. A military person might only pass through the annual process once from the perspective of a particular job, and so it can make it difficult for them to project the kind of confidence and control that you would want. In fact, this diversity of strengths and weaknesses between military and civilians leads to an organizational model that you'll see a lot in the Pentagon, and that is co-chairs. You'll often see important forums led by one military and one civilian, often like a colonel in a GS-15. They often represent different offices like manning and training, and as a result, they give the whole process the advantages of both types of employees. In fact, and without getting too far in the weeds, you'll notice that this pairing of civilians and military, it even exists with the Joint Chief of Staff and the service secretaries. Now, one thing that's the same between military and government civilians is that as government employees, they can both represent the government. The third type of employee, they can't do that because they are not government employees. These are your government contractors. Compared to military and civilian, well, the contractors can be a lot less homogeneous. They can be a fresh-faced college grad or a cranky old GS-15 who retired but still wants to play the game, or even a sort of a dazed prior enlisted. And the contractors are far more limited in their scope of activities. While a military person can get involved in just about anything they have the energy and stamina for, a contractor has to stay within the bounds of their performance work statement. The advantage of a contract worker is that they can quickly come and just as easily go away. I mean, just try to create a new GS-14 position. Even when it's easy, it's not easy. And there's only so many E8s to go around, so if you want one of those, it's going to be a nasty fight. But in a moment of national need, those contract employees can expand rapidly. The one caution about relying on contract workers is that he who lives by easy money dies by easy money. When money is easy to get, lots of organizations spring up like desert flowers, only to wither and vanish when the money gets tight. And the telltale sign that an organization is going to disappear is it's filled with mostly contractors. Okay, let's check where we are before we get into the less visible qualities of the people operating this system. The Pentagon is a biocomputer made up of human beings who compete for resources. Individuals take in information, process it, and then kick it out. They are structured into the three-layer model to compete against other organizations. They use military for short, high-intensity work, government civilians for long-range consistency, and contractors for rapid expansion and contraction. Now, let's get back to the individual, and we're going to focus on how they process information. Roughly speaking, you have three behaviors, and you can kind of think of these like Dungeons and Dragons classes. You got operators, analysts, and advisors. Operators are mission-focused. They're good at driving people and timelines. Often, operators have some kind of combat arms background, but they aren't necessarily current military. They could just be a contractor or a government civilian with that military operator mentality shining through. These guys tend to be good at briefing, and their Microsoft weapon of choice is PowerPoint. Analysts, these are your numbers guys. They can make the data beg for mercy, and they always have just one more thing they want to tell you. You'll know that you're dealing with an analyst because they'll want to use Microsoft Excel to brief people. Then you got advisors. Law, policy, regulation, that's their kind of thing. Writing it, editing it, and interpreting it. Obviously, advisors include lawyers, some chaplains, but you'd be surprised how many senior NCOs and warrant officers perform this function. To round out your Microsoft Office suite, these guys prefer to use Word. This attribute of whether an individual is an operator, an analyst, or an advisor is the aspect of your organization's own little mix that you have the least control over in the short term. But it's also the aspect that might matter the most. Therefore, it's a factor that you want to pay a lot of attention to because you want to get the right mix. And like I said before, what's really important is a balanced mix. To be able to compete and win this fight for resources, you got to be able to brief why a particular COA is best for the mission. You have to be able to explain why the numbers show that this is the best COA. And it's always helpful to be able to link this COA to existing guidance or regulation. Your operators have to be able to out-operate their operators. Your analysts have to be able to out-analyze their analysts, and it's the same thing with the advisors. And so you might find yourself looking around and saying, ugh, I need a contractor who can fill this gap, or I need an operator who can speak their language. The one caution is, never assume that a person is like an operator or analyst or advisor just because of their bio. You will meet some math majors who are not particularly analytical. There's infantry officers who don't really think like other operators. And so ultimately what differentiates and distinguishes a person is how they behave under pressure. But so what? I mean, what could all of this possibly mean for you? Well, I have won a lot of bureaucratic contests over the years. I mean, I've lost a lot too, so don't get the wrong idea. And often, the difference between winning and losing is recognizing that you're part of a team and how the pieces of those teams fit together. And then overwhelming your adversary at the point where their team is weak. I have seen offices try to push an initiative without having any action officers doing the groundwork. And then their executives just get crushed by an overwhelming amount of information that they couldn't possibly keep up with. I have seen highly technical analysts try to go it alone without an operator, only to falter when they discovered that nobody on their team was able to explain the impacts on readiness or how this fit into mission requirements. I have watched people send a contractor to decision forums where contractors aren't even allowed to talk. In fact, I've also seen situations where some executive just skips a meeting and sends their colonel, and guess how fast that office gets ignored. So, if your organization is not performing as well as you'd like it to be, look at the mix of people on your team. Identify the gaps and fill them. And if you can't get new people, at least try to properly align the ones you have. In the meantime, watch the other team. In particular, are they presenting a weak flank? Because you'd be surprised the number of times when just the right person sent to just the right meeting can accomplish amazing things. And now, if you want to get a more refined understanding of those government civilians, watch this video.